Can we nudge the world into a greener future even when the new behaviors are not seen to visibly or immediately improve the outcomes for the individuals? The answer is yes, through incentives. But what are these incentives? How do we design them? And are there any real world examples of these successful climate initiatives? To help us navigate this, we are joined by Elliott Harris, a seasoned macroeconomist with a vast experience of working both with the UN and the IMF. His last assignment with the UN was as its Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. So, whether you are a policy professional, a business leader, or an individual interested in climate solutions, this episode offers valuable insights as to how a smart policy design can lead to a transition of a sustainable future. Thank you so much, Elliott, for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Elliott, in our conversations around climate action, you focused a lot on incentives for positive climate action. Can we first begin by understanding why is it so important for us to focus on incentives for driving positive climate action?
Yes, well, I think it starts by recognizing that effective climate action is not a matter for national governments alone. I believe everyone has to contribute to the fight against climate change. And in fact, a lot of the change in behavior in production that has to happen will have to happen on the private side of things, among non-government actors, because those are the ones whose behavior is generating the greenhouse gas emissions that are leading to the global warming and the climate change in the first place. So we all need to contribute in this fight against climate change, and many people do realize this, but people often need to have good reasons to change their behavior, to change their choices, especially when the new behaviors are not seen to immediately and visibly improve the outcomes for the individuals. And this is where the incentives question comes in. Because the right kinds of incentives, they can often tip the scale. They can make the advantages of a positive climate action large enough for the individual to see his or her benefit in pursuing that action. Or the incentive can reduce a perceived cost or a perceived disadvantage from a given climate action. That disadvantage might have been holding the individual back from taking the action in the past. A concrete example would be greater use of public transportation, especially commuter transit. This can reduce carbon emissions considerably, but public transportation often compares unfavorably to using private vehicles in terms of lack of convenience or overall cost and access. Now, if we can lower the cost of public transportation, if we can redesign bus routes and optimize timetables to provide better coverage and easier access to the public transportation, then we can make that shift from private to public transportation easier for the individual to make. On the other side, alternatively, the public policy can make the use of private cars less attractive. It can raise the taxes on gasoline, for example, or the cost of parking in congested downtown areas. It can change the patterns of traffic lights to favor bus and bike lanes. It can introduce tolls on roads or other forms of congestion pricing. All of these are possibilities that can impact the decision that individuals make. Now, the individual consumer does not face additional costs from those first types of measures, those that reduce the cost or improve the access. And so those types of measures will always be received more favorably by consumers than the second type of measures, which often do entail increased costs. And in fact, often it is some combination between the two types of measures that can be most effective in incentivizing the initial change in behavior or in consumer choices. And I think that is why one has to pay close attention to the role that incentives can play in driving change.
Elliott, can we talk about one such incentive that you experienced? I mean, I know there are plethora of examples here, but one such incentive that you saw playing out in real world wherein we had effectively achieved results?
Well, my favorite example actually stems from a combination, a hybrid of incentives, and it stems from the year 2010 in Northern Virginia, where I used to live, just outside of Washington, D.C. in the United States. and it was a combination of different incentives. In order to encourage the purchase of hybrid vehicles, now back in those days we didn't have fully electric vehicles, it was hybrid vehicles, and to reduce greenhouse gases in that way, the municipal government in that county changed the rules to allow the use of a major highway that led into Washington, D.C. during rush hour, allowing you to use that highway with less than 2 people in your car if your car was an ultra-low emissions vehicle. At the same time, the state authorities reduced the tax rate on these ultra-low emission vehicles and increased the tax rate on other types of vehicles. And then thirdly, the state and local authorities encouraged local banks to offer lower interest rates on loans for the purchase of the low emissions vehicle. Now, the combination of this regulatory measure with the highway access, the tax measure, reducing the tax on the hybrid cars, and the private financial incentive, the lower interest rate on car loans, was very, very successful in encouraging an increase in hybrid vehicle purchases in the surrounding 2 counties. And it was a combination of the 3 that I think made it most effective. Now, you find that there are all sorts of effective action that can be taken, but I want to make one point particularly clear. The kinds of incentives that we talk about and that are available for governments to put in place are not incentives that can spur action at the international level. And in fact, I'm not even sure that most or much positive climate action will take place at the international level. Decisions, yes, but action much less so. Perhaps the best example I can think of an international set of incentives is the European emissions trading system, that cap and trading system that sets caps on the amount of carbon emissions and then allows companies to trade them while reducing them year to year. In my view, effective action is much more likely at the national level, and especially at the subnational level. Many countries, for example, have national taxes on fossil fuel use. Some of those taxes have been in place for a very long time. But in addition to these price-based measures, you can have regulatory restrictions. For example, emission standards that legally restrict the volume of carbon emissions from various processes and sectors, like automobiles or power plants. And you can have other types of incentives as well. In the United States, for example, right now, there are important federal income tax deductions available to consumers who buy electric vehicles or install solar panels on their homes. And these incentives are seeking to encourage consumers to choose the more climate-friendly options. So there's a whole range of possible incentives, and very many countries have put in place some or many of them. But I think that is something that we have to pay more attention to, making sure that we identify the possible incentives that can help to drive the change in behavior, and then putting them in place for the greatest possible impact.
Elliott, some of these incentives seem obvious, but considering the progress on climate action, I'm assuming that there must be many roadblocks, many challenges to designing these incentives. Do you want to briefly touch on the challenges that we can face while identifying these incentives and maybe how we can overcome them?
Well, I do agree that we do face serious challenges in designing incentives. And I think the biggest and most important one is to decide on what type of incentives would make the most sense in a given circumstance. Because as I said, there are broadly 2 types of incentives. The ones which I will call the negative incentives, those incentives don't emphasize the advantages of new behavior or new consumer choices. What they do is they raise the disadvantages of the older choices. So, for example, a fossil fuel tax, a carbon tax, will make it more expensive to consume fossil fuels or to generate carbon emissions. Right? But then there are the other types of incentives that do actually emphasize the advantages of the shift. Right? So that, I think, is the first stage of designing an appropriate pattern of incentives. The negative incentives do not emphasize the advantages of the new choices. They focus on increasing the disadvantages of the old ones and forcing people or encouraging people to change their patterns because they really have no choice. Sometimes that's necessary. For example, in many countries you have fuel emission standards that oblige car companies to make their new cars much more fuel efficient. Consumers looking to buy a new car no longer have the choice of buying a car with a less fuel efficient engine. And so they're obliged to go with the new technology. The other type, the second type of incentive, will encourage the consumer to choose, deliberately to choose, things that are more climate friendly by either reducing the price of these new products and technologies or facilitating easier access to them. And so this helps you to overcome the initial reluctance to drop the old habits. Let me come back to that example I gave of that combined incentive back in 2010. That's when I bought my first hybrid vehicle to take advantage of those changes, including the easier access into Washington, D.C. using that highway. A couple of years later, I switched from the hybrid to a fully electric vehicle, in part to take advantage of the major tax rebates that were on offer for the new purchases. I installed solar panels also to take advantage of the new incentives. But today, in 2024, I realized I would never again think about buying a gasoline car, because having driven an electric car now for some 7 or 8 years, I realized that the cost of operating an electric vehicle is so much lower than the cost of operating a gasoline vehicle that it makes absolutely no economic sense for me to shift back. I have the solar panels that are generating electricity that save me hundreds of dollars a month in electricity bills, but they also allow me to charge my electric car for free. I can travel around without paying for fuel. And that consideration has nothing to do with the fact that I am emitting no carbon. And it has everything to do with the fact that it would be silly of me to go and buy a car, a gasoline car, that costs me more to operate. And I think that is where the incentives made the initial decision easier at a time when the cost of buying an electric car was higher. But now that I have settled into this, it makes perfect sense for me to stay here, because on all counts, on all fronts, this is superior technology, and it allows me at the same time to reduce my carbon footprint. Now, I do think that is what you have to think about in terms of designing your own incentives. How do you help people make the initial incentive to go forward? And then how do you make it attractive for them to continue with these climate-friendly solutions? Government's going to offer a lot of positive incentives, but these often come with a cost to the government. But alternatively, it can introduce measures that make the climate-damaging choices more expensive, more difficult. The sweet spot is somewhere in between, the combination between the positive and the negative incentives, and one needs to find a way to shift from those costly positive incentives to the less costly but more sustainable incentives over time.
Elliott, building on to what you've just said, are there ways or things to keep in mind while we are designing these incentives to have the maximum impact? And I think what you've just told, that whenever we are designing these incentives, there will be a cost. And I'm assuming any incentive would with itself carry some unintended consequences. So while we are designing this package, are there things that we must consider?
Well, as I just said, getting the maximum impact from a set of climate incentives will often mean mixing different types of incentives. Positive incentives that encourage a shift, a willing shift towards climate-friendly solutions, and negative incentives that discourage continuing to use climate-unfriendly solutions. And the real challenge there is to strike the right balance between the positive incentives, which generally tend to cost something, and the negative incentives, which shift the cost over onto the consumer or the producer. Now, it's important, I think, to work through three different things. First, what specific consumer or producer choices and decisions are being targeted by the public policy? What kind of behavior and choice does the public policy want to change? Second, one has to consider whether price-based measures are necessary or whether regulatory measures would be enough to cause that change in behavior, cause the choice to be different. But the third thing, and this is the important one, is to reflect very carefully on exactly how an incentive would really cause a change in producer and consumer choices. What is it about the incentive that makes the change happen? And that's really important, because when you do that reflection, it can help you to identify not only what will change in the way people make their decisions and perhaps how fast it will change, and so help you to decide, well, where exactly do you want to set the incentive and what mixture of incentives do you want? But it can also help you to identify any possible unintended consequences. So, for example, if you decide that you want to use higher carbon pricing to raise the price of gasoline to encourage people to drive less, then you have that consequence, which is higher prices of gasoline at the pump. And understanding that many people will find it difficult to avoid driving entirely, you realize that you might actually be contributing to a higher overall cost to consumers, and perhaps even spur a slight uptick in inflation. And these are some of the potential unintended consequences you'd have to take into account. So looking at the mechanisms by which the incentive will cause someone to change behavior, in this case, it would be an increased price at the pump, then that helps you to understand, well, what might be the unintended consequences. But what is critically important here is that it can help, that reflection can help you to identify cases where the mixture of the positive incentive and the negative incentive, the cost-based incentive and the price-based incentive, might generate more of an impact than using one type of measure alone or the other. As more climate-friendly alternatives become feasible and affordable, the balance between the positive and the negative incentives can shift. And it may be possible over time to limit the explicit cost to the budget of having to provide subsidies or tax breaks, and allow for an increasing reliance on regulatory measures to keep spurring that change in behavior. So again, I think it's a constant reconsideration of the situation. What might be optimal today would no longer be optimal tomorrow. And so policymakers have to be continually reviewing the impact that they're having with their measures, moving away from things that don't seem to be working well, moving towards things that offer the prospect of greater success.
Elliott, we talked about like changes and incentives for a particular measure that we want to implement. But talking about incentives, can we trickle it down on a very individual level and then talk about certain incentives for individuals in particular, which motivates them to make climate conscious or friendly choices in their everyday lives? So while we are talking on a policy level to achieve a particular policy objective, but can we rather design incentives or some examples that you might want to share so that we can instill that in the ethos of a consumer or an individual person? Because from what you're saying is that it's about bringing everyone together.
I think we have to. I do think, as I said from the very beginning, there are perhaps a few governments who are the largest consumers and producers in their respective economies. And that makes them the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and consequently it is their action that will cause effective climate action in their country. But the number of countries with that kind of dominant government is disappearingly small, right? The change has to happen among non-government actors, so we have to think about how do we get that, right? The first and most important thing, I think, in mobilizing change at the individual level is to raise people's awareness of the nature of the problem. You know? I mean, it's fine for us to talk about climate change and what is going on, but people have to understand that they too are contributing to some of the greenhouse gases that are driving global warming, that they too are suffering from the consequences of climate change, and that their decisions can help in making us more successful in adapting to climate change, in mitigating the climate change, and that each of us, although our contribution might be tiny, disappearingly small, when you add it all up, we get to the kind of change that we need in order to be effective in fighting climate change. And so that's the first thing, awareness, not just of the nature of the problem and what's causing it, but awareness also of the possible solutions and how each of us can actually participate in those solutions. And that requires an awareness campaign and a public information campaign, which is, well, not always as effectively designed as it could be. But if people know what is causing the problem, and if they know what kinds of solutions are available to deal with the problem, then they are better placed to make the kinds of changes in their own behavior, in their own choices, that will allow us to move ahead on the climate front. Once that is in place, once people know, well, okay, I can contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by perhaps not driving my private car as much as I did before if I can go instead on public transportation for this trip or for that trip. And you might not know how much of a contribution that is. You might not think that you're making that much of a difference. But if we all do it, then we are indeed making that kind of difference. But we'll have to know about that before we can decide to make that change. We also have to know, well, are there things out there that could make it easier for me as an individual to make that change? And I mentioned some of them. Good case in point, if I am going to be buying a car and I have to buy, I can make a choice between an electric car or a hybrid car or a regular gasoline car. Is there anything out there that can make it more attractive for me to consider a climate-friendly car as opposed to a climate-unfriendly car? And in many cases there are. I mean, as I say, it could be that you might get a car loan that is cheaper in terms of interest rates for a hybrid vehicle or an electric vehicle than it is for a gasoline vehicle. And if you can do that, then it becomes interesting for you to consider taking the climate-friendly choice. If there is a tax difference and you pay less to the government to drive an electric or a low emissions car, well, then that is also something that you would take into account and help you make that decision. And so that's where the incentives come in. But again, you will only be able to take advantage of those positive incentives if you are aware that they exist. The other thing to think about, though, is that the negative incentives, well, you might be more willing to accept them as a consumer if you understand why they are there. So many people will feel sort of put upon if gasoline prices rise because it's so important for them. But if they understand what the reason is behind raising the gasoline tax, that it is intended to encourage people to think about ways in which they can reduce their use of gasoline by making the gasoline more expensive, well, then perhaps that becomes somewhat more acceptable to them. It doesn't seem as much as an imposition as it does an unfortunate but necessary change that will encourage them to think about how they can change the way they consume gasoline. So it's really critical, I think, to focus on, well, what kind of change are we looking for? Who has to make the change? How can the change be made? And what are the various ways in which we can take advantage of incentives or adapt to negative incentives that are put in place to help us to make that change more rapidly?
Elliott, before we move to our LinkedIn question, the concluding question from my end would be that you talked about some of the incentives that you were impressed with, but is there something that you are looking at in the near future, some sort of designing of incentives in any particular industry that you're looking at and you think holds a lot of promise towards accelerating climate action?
I do believe that there is still a lot of unrealized scope for us to move to a cleaner, renewable generation of energy that just steps away from fossil fuels. Now, a lot of critics will say that we can't eliminate fossil fuels immediately, and I think they're quite right. This is a process, but we can do it at an increasingly rapid rate. Now, where I see a huge advantage is that there are large parts of the world that are under-electrified right now, and their development is being hindered by this. And we have an opportunity to accelerate development, economic and social development, in a way that does not repeat the mistakes of the industrialized societies in growing their dependence on fossil fuels. So from that perspective, I think that there is this real advantage that we have in that we know now what kinds of technologies can be helpful. Those technologies are available, and every day, as we speak, those technologies are becoming cheaper and more accessible to far many more people, far many more countries. And I think it is incumbent upon us to take stock of all of these options that we have and to make sure that we mobilize these options to the extent possible and extend the frontier within which we can deploy these technologies, these new options, these new choices. I do believe that we have to be making a concerted effort to point out to people that there are things that we can do effectively now. That these things, as we do them, do not cause our daily lives to be significantly worse. In fact, they don't cause our daily lives to be worse at all. They make our daily lives better. That we have huge benefits that we can realize simply by the fact that we reduce the use of fossil fuels means that we reduce the amount of air pollution that we put out into the atmosphere and improve global public health that way. It is perhaps something that nobody thinks about, but there are over 7 to 8 million people every year who die prematurely from respiratory disease caused by air pollution, a large part of which is driven by fossil fuels. These are things that many of us are not aware of. We don't see these interconnections, and yet these are things that can make it much more palatable, much more interesting for us to move ahead in a decided manner, generating solutions, implementing, deploying these technologies as quickly as we can, because the benefits are there, they're manifest, and the costs of putting these things in place are going down. What we need to do is ensure that the finance is made available and that the technologies are accessible, not only to those who can afford them, but also to those who have difficulty affording them now, because we all benefit from that in the road ahead.
Thank you so much for that response. Elliott, we've received 2 questions from LinkedIn, but I think you've answered one of them already. So I'll move to the second question, which was submitted by Tanmay. He asks, assuming that the incentives are monetary in nature, how can economically weaker nations facing extreme cases of climate change fund the incentivization in addition to other costs affiliated with country operations?
I do believe that this is one of the areas where international cooperation remains critical. I said, we cooperate on a global level to set objectives, the overall objectives, and we will then at a national level seek to implement these objectives. Great. But technology and finance are 2 of the biggest ways in which we can move forward towards these better possibilities, but they are also 2 of the biggest obstacles. Effective climate action requires replacing old technologies that are climate unfriendly with new technologies that don't harm the climate. But the access to these technologies for mitigating climate change and for adapting to it, that access is not equally distributed. Right? There are patent laws and intellectual property rights that have to be considered. And it's a simple fact of life that poorer countries, as the comment noted, they have less access to these technologies. That is an area where international cooperation can play a major role. One can cooperate internationally among countries to try to ensure that this technology, which very often is driven, innovated by private entities, that this technology is made available and distributed effectively and equitably so that communities and countries that are not as well off do also have access to this, don't have to go through the path that the industrialized nations went through 100 years ago, and then have to recover from climate change that we know we can avoid ex ante. But for all of this to happen, the technology has to be made accessible, and the finance also has to be available so that these technologies can be deployed. But I want to make 2 additional points here. First, I am not necessarily talking about money going from one government to another, because I will come back to the point that in many cases, the changes that we need to see are changes that do not imply government production, government consumption. Right? It's the people, it's the industries, it's the companies, it's the societies. They have to make those changes. And finance that goes from one government to another government, that's only the first step. That finance, once it's received has to be distributed in a way that allows all who need the technology to get access to the technology. The second point, though, is that just putting the money on the table is not necessarily the end of the problem. Throwing money at a problem very seldom solves it. The solutions have to be appropriate to the specific local context. So if you have a small community in the Sahel, hydroelectricity is not really going to be a feasible option. It's going to be tremendously expensive at a scale that perhaps is prohibitive, and is not going to be advantageous compared to solar technology, which happily today is fully scalable. You can put one solar panel on the roof of your house, or you can put 50, but you can do it at the scale that's required. In some places, solar technology, if you're living up in the northern coast of Scotland, solar technology is not going to be your solution, but wind-based energy might be. And so there, again, the finance and the technology have to be combined in ways that are suitable for the specific local context. And I think that that is one of the things where we can do a lot more through a collaborative approach internationally, because somewhere, somehow, somebody has already experimented with and found the solution that is most appropriate to your specific local context. And then we can decide how best to bring together the access to the technology and the finance needed to purchase it in a way that is manageable for that community. Cooperation is perhaps the best way to do it.
Thank you so much, Elliott, for all these insights. I've certainly gained a lot with respect to how to approach a problem and how to view it, and how there can be this delicate balance between top-down and bottom-up approach, and that too from the positive and negative incentive side. So, highly grateful for your time. And before we conclude this call, I'll leave it up to you if you have any last thoughts which you might want to share.
Well, thank you, Anirudh. It's been a pleasure being with you today. I do think that this is one area where we can do an awful lot more. And that is the area of raising awareness. A lot of people may know of solar power, but a lot of people may not realize how much more accessible solar power has become in the last 4 or 5 years. It's quite amazing. And something that they may have been considering to be out of their reach may in fact be feasible, possible for them. And information and awareness, that can help them realize, hey, I can make more of a contribution. And making that contribution isn't just about reducing the carbon footprint of my community or the carbon footprint of my country or meeting some international objective my government signed a treaty on. No, this is something that will help me. If I can generate some of my own electricity with a solar panel or with a wind turbine in my garden, then I have to pay less every month in utility bills. My income goes farther. I can do more of the things that are important for me, even while I can still have the electricity that my family requires. And the fact that these options are now available, or more available to people, I think that is something that is information that has to be shared. And the fact that there are incentives and there are tax rebates and there are subsidies that are available, again, that is information that has to be shared. And the more we do it and the more people put these things in place, the more the price will come down, the more affordable it will all become. And this is so clearly evident over the last 10 years, particularly in the solar area and in electric vehicles. It is a tendency that is going even further, and the options for people now are much more rich and much more varied. And I think it really would help if government spend some time thinking about how can we make this information more accessible, more available, and more easily understood. That way, I think, we'll start to see change happen in the way people behave and what they choose.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elliott, for your time. And I hope listeners gain a lot more from what you've told, and it is a starting point for many more people to design policies effectively and approach the problem in a way with which a lot of more people can benefit. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me.